Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. I'm here with Jarrett.
Hey, great to be
Jarrett,
on here.
what's one thing you love and one thing you hate?
Oh God, obviously an easy one to say I love of my kids, but God, I'm on the spot. I'm having trouble thinking, but I'll come up with something. One thing I'd probably hate, given I was just writing about it, is just people going off on things that perhaps they don't necessarily have all the information on. And
Dude,
I
that's
get that.
a that's a big one, man. Oh my God. It's like, all
Now, when
right.
I say that, I don't mean like if you've got an opinion, that's fine. It's when people are certain they're right.
So I just literally got done talking about this, and it's probably been I think on everyone's mind is obviously what's going on in the world right now. But I think a lot of my issue is with the government is that we expect them to be like, I guess, doctors. Like you go to them, like you have all the answers, you know exactly what's wrong with me. And they don't understand that they're probably just trying to figure it out as much as we are. So like with everything that everyone's like, I can't believe the government did this or that. I'm like, they're fucking trying to figure out what life is. It's like sometimes there's information that we're not leaked to. And like my buddy's a big source checker. He's like, I always want to make sure I got the facts. It's a credible source. And I'm like, yeah, that's good. But that credible source, let's say you're a PhD professor. You spent 15 years studying a certain topic in history. Let's say when the Mayflower was built. You spent 15 years focusing on that specific event. You have all this information. You wrote a book on it. Okay. What happens if then a year after you wrote that book and you're known as the guy to go to about the Mayflower, someone tells you, did you know this is actually what happened? And it completely revolutionizes your train of thought. Then that thing that was a credible source is no longer a credible source. It's all about these perspectives. Like everyone always considers the Americans taking over the Native Americans' land, but nobody understands the perspective of the time and what the Native Americans did. We only hear all about our conquering. So it's like once you start finding that there's like certain pathways or certain things, it's like driving on a highway where it's like, we're supposed to take a left right here. There used to be a highway right here. Where's the highway? It's like, oh, it's not there anymore. There's a different road. It's like, oh, so that pathway is just completely gone, but it doesn't mean it was never there. It just means we have new information now.
Yeah, and I'd say as someone who's involved a lot with bureaucracies, it's there's just so many times when they won't admit they're wrong and change things, and I think that's part of what people get so frustrated with government because you have these everyday things where you're dealing with stuff, you're trying to get your paperwork, whatever done, and you have a bureaucracy that basically says we've always done it this way, we've always got it right, and they just won't change. And as someone who works in that type of industry, like I'm just saying, if there was an ability to say we're wrong or we were wrong, like I even see that with the pandemic. Early on, they said masks wouldn't necessarily work. Now, of course, we're told to wear masks, and I think it's a good idea. But I can understand how some people see that as, well, wait, why did the story change, and how did it change so quickly? And I guess maybe it's the idea, like you were saying, of when you have these authorities, you have to recognize that they're almost, I don't want to call them temporal authorities, but authority in the moment. Like this is what we know best right now. And at some point we're going to have to move on.
Yeah, like I always crack the joke like people always say the constitution it's meant to be like you can make amendments to it. You can change it if you want. It has that ability to. I'm like, but how bad does that look like? Imagine the meeting of them making the constitution and they're writing down and he goes, wait, oh, it's a spell error. Let me cross it out. Don't cross it out. That's my only copy. What are you doing? We're writing with ink. We're writing with ink. It's going to look terrible. It's going to look like a crappy draft. Then I got to rewrite the whole thing, spend all night and hours. My wife spent countless hours drying that piece of paper to the point where it looks like papyrus. And now you're going to fucking just cross it out right on the page. Like there's this whole idea of like, we say something, we act like we know 100% of the truth of it, and it's just like, no, you're figuring it out just as much as the next guy, which is like when I started to look at everyone in life, I was like, you're not on a different level than me. I'm thinking that you're on a different level than me. We always used to put PhD, this giant word, in front of everything, and it made you seem so elegant. And in society today, still, if you go up saying, my name is Doctor This, everyone's like, oh my God, you're fucking a wizard. You could, if I die right now, you could save my life. And it's like, well, I'm actually a doctor of comedy. And you're like, oh, So you're not really a doctor. Well, I got my degree for it. It's like, okay, that's just a piece of paper. It does shouldn't define your level of intelligence, but the way we've gone in society has. And it's just interesting to me to see what we're following and like what is like, is anybody else questioning this shit? Like, I'm glad to know that someone like yourself is at least thinking a little bit like, hey, there are some things that are like, yeah, they don't have 100% of the answers. It's kind of like when a doctor says, open up your mouth. He kind of just tosses a couple of pills in your mouth, hoping what sticks is the dosage you're going to take.
Yeah, and I mean, the only thing I'd add is my issue then is when people go, I think what I'd call the other way, where it's like, okay, all the experts are wrong. Nobody knows anything, so I'm going to listen to this guy who tells me to drink bleach. Like that's where I see it going the other way too much sometimes. Of yeah, there are a lot of problems with the people who runs things. There's a lot of problem with the experts. Never believe 100%, in my opinion, in anything. Maybe that sounds a little too pessimistic or cynical, but there always be a room for a question. It's kind of like everyone just picks the best thing to go along with. Like, this is the best thing we have in terms of evidence, in terms of people who study the issue and know some of it. And so that would be what we go along with until, like you said, something else comes along, until we get more information, until we know better. I again though, I always like, not to go back to the bleach thing, but there's so many things I read about where, it's like, oh, drink apple cider vinegar, do
Yeah.
and it's kind of like, well, yeah, there's lots of problems with doctors, but let's not go that route.
See, it literally hits this avenue of like if you start a group or you start like a country, for instance, we as Americans or as any other country has really kind of grown, has learned to establish group type thinking where it's like we're going to try and isolate things that are different from us based on like, hey, we're all going to vote on this and you're the one guy that's not voting on this. So maybe you should just leave our group. It's kind of like surrounding yourself with everyone that thinks the exact same. And I'm like, if I own a group, I want there to be those people that are going to raise questions. Yeah, it's going to suck. It's like, hey guys, let's go to Fridays for dinner. And then one dude's in the back, like, I don't really want to go to Fridays. I want to go to Applebee's. And you're just like, fuck, like, we're
And
not
then
going
he's
to,
going to debate Fridays versus Applebee's,
yeah.
for a while.
And then you're not going to be able to go to Fridays because then he brings up some good points and everyone else in the car starts changing their mind. Then one dude tosses out Dairy Queen. You're like, oh my God, like, we're not even going to be able to go out to eat. What's the point? I understand that side of things, but it is very, very rational to have another person thinking something different. I think that's a problem with any groups that you get into, any systems of government that you get into, is that everybody's thinking the exact same. Surround yourself with people that do not think the same as you. I love to see that back and forth. It doesn't mean it needs to be an argument or a debate, but it's a way of expressing different perspectives. Understanding someone else's perspective is probably the biggest challenge as Americans that we have, or just as people that we have. There's really hard to get over that own ego and that own train of thought when you've spent so much time seeing different sources and different things of information. I'm not saying that you're not right or you're not wrong, but saying on the fact of maybe that person, you need to see their perspective to see how they thought that way. Like people that say school lunches shouldn't be free. That's an argument that really hit hard with me in one of my podcasts because I was like, you don't think kids should get free lunches? And to clarify on his point, he is a debate podcaster, so it was kind of him trying to get a rise out of me. But I'm like, you don't think kids should get free lunches? Like, hold on a second. Like, I've been to school as a little kid hungry before, and I think that's important to have that. Some kids can't. They're little kids; they don't have jobs. And he goes,
And it's not their fault.
yeah, and he goes, starts talking. He goes, "No, I don't think they should get free lunches." And I said, "Hold on a second. You're a private school teacher, so kids going to that school are paying a lot of money. So yeah, that makes sense that you wouldn't think that they should get free lunches. They should have to be able to buy a lunch if they're paying $50,000 to go to school. But public school," he goes, "Yeah, public school. I think they should get free lunches." Just that little bit of talking, there was no argument. It just got solved like that. I'm like, that could happen so much throughout history where people could just talk it out like that and not and kind of get over their own ego, be like, all right, well, if you're not going to agree with me, then this is over with. It's like, fuck. How many times have you seen a standoff in a movie where a dude dies because they couldn't come to a conclusion on something as simple as like, we're going to go on this raid and we're going to do this? Well, I don't like that idea. I think we should take the cautious route. And it's like, I don't like the way you're thinking. I don't like that at all.
No, and also like, well, maybe we could talk about this for a few minutes before we shoot. Like,
Yeah.
just what are you pissed off about? What do you want to happen here? And I mean, I found it funny listening to the school lunch thing you were talking about because I'm more of a left-wing person. I work in a bureaucracy, but I'm friends with some people who are business owners, and I try to see it from their perspective of they're annoyed by, regulations, red tape, paperwork, etc. And I try to tell them perspective of, well, government and the like is responding more to things go wrong. And then everyone, like, one business does something wrong. It dumps a bunch of stuff in the drinking water by accident, on purpose, because they're greedy, who knows? So we have to come in and clean it up. People always go to government, always go to bureaucracy. And so I try to say that's the perspective that the people who are putting those regulations that are seeming like a nuisance are trying to do. And then I get it on the other side. You're trying to make a living. You just want to, like, do your job, do your service, make your money and pay your workers, take care of your family. But there's two different things that got to go together there. And like you said, maybe sometimes if the polarization isn't so extreme like it can seem sometimes, like I know left and right now in the US, and we have a lesser extent of that in Canada. But yeah, it's there of just maybe understanding where people are coming from. Like, why do you believe this? Do you believe this because, you believe in God, or you believe in something with around free enterprise, like you're an Ayn Randian or something,
Yeah. Well, I mean, before
Like, I
back,
think if you talked a bit more, yeah.
I about to say back in the day, if you would have analyzed how fast history was progressing, it was at a steady rate of slowly increasing of like building ships, learning how to travel to different lands and understanding more of different cultures. But then we're at this point now where like in the last 20 years, I think we've advanced more than quadruple probably anything throughout history with just inventions and how far technology is just progressing. We've hit this like niche of like evolving so quickly, which I think is an issue because now it's gotten to this point where I think one of the old methods of thinking was like, if that person or, if that person doesn't agree with you, then just walk away. Then just walk away. You don't need to associate with that person if you're just going to argue and fight back and forth. It's like once you started doing that, then you had a bunch of people that just started going, I don't like your thought. And then they just make their own group. And then it's a bunch of mini groups now where it's like mini cults everywhere. And I'm like, your group is exactly the same. You're vegan. And then that guy's vegan. He goes, no, they only eat tofu. We eat other types of soy. And I'm like, you're just making your group even more specific. Doesn't mean you guys don't have the same ideas just because you disagree on one thing or you guys have a preference of one thing doesn't split you off into a whole other category. But the issue is when labels were created. Whoever made the fucking label maker is a genius and an asshole because you're already splitting people into categories of you think this way, you're this way, and then you start putting labels on people, and then you don't choose to understand why that is chosen that way. You don't understand to hear that person out. And that's the biggest problem throughout history. I mean, it might be different because I'm in America and you're in Canada. You obviously do the podcast where you study Canadian history as well. The Counterfactual Canuck. Shout out to yourself. That's an amazing
Thank
name.
you.
But how much of like your history have you started looking at? Like there's still things in the past that are still messing up kind of things that are going on today.
Well, I'd say unfortunately with Canada, there's a lot of that. And most of that stems around something that I've tried to educate myself on, because obviously I'm an old white guy, is the Indigenous people of Canada and the different nations that existed prior to Europeans coming over. And I think it's just something that most of Canada hasn't come to grips with of what happened. Like, you were talking before about context, and yes, when you go back to the 16th 17th centuries, there was it was a lot more brutal time. People did just come take somebody's land, but we're trying to look at it more now in a 21st century perspective where, okay, that wasn't, let's be honest, the right way to do things. The law of conquest is perhaps not the best thing going forward in a world with 8 billion people and thousands of nuclear weapons. So how do we look back at this history of how we just came over, took the land, pushed them off, killed a bunch of them, put them onto reserves, which had horrible conditions and still do to this day? There's a ton of First Nations reserves in Canada that don't have proper drinking water, have no economic opportunity. And yet there's still a lot, at least in my left-wing opinion, a lot of lingering racism blaming the Indigenous people for their own state without looking at the history. And that to me is one of the prime examples of, well, no, if you go back and see, like, we signed this treaty saying we were only going to go on this amount of land, but then we took the land we gave to them, pushed them somewhere else, kept pushing, and eventually they're in like a tiny square in the middle of nowhere with no water. And that's one of the prime examples I see. I could even see a bit in American history. I don't want to touch on this too much, but like I often see a lot of people, and I hate to say it, white people, don't really think about what living in slavery must have been like. Like, what was day to day life like when you were a slave? What did you do? How did you feel? And I think they just kind of see it as like, oh yeah, they were workers, or they lived in bunkhouses or something. Like I see sometimes the picture that's out there, and I just wonder, I just can't see how people don't relate to what that could have been like to live that way. And I think that resonates today in American culture as well.
Do you think that in Canada, for instance, one of the kind of issues I would say would be the fact of like you guys don't have a freedom of speech? Because I look at it in two parts. I think that freedom of speech is important, but I also think it helps and also worsens your country a little bit too. Because I don't think you should ever get fined for saying something like inappropriate or something that's like on your mind, a thought or something. Like you should never have legal ramifications across that. But then it keeps people from saying some really outrageous and causing tension that I would call maybe a form of gaslighting to other people. Like in America, everyone talks about like you guys are just crazy fighting over there all the time. Yeah, because people can say whatever the fuck they want, and that's an issue. Because some people say stuff and don't even think it through, and next thing you know, there's a fight going on. It's like in Canada, I look at it, I'm like, you guys are regulated on what you guys can say. I mean, not so much to where it's like you're in like Korea or something, but to the point where it's like, hey, this isn't going to be something to post on social media. That's not very good. The craziest thing I saw a woman who tweeted that she got a job at NASA. And she was like, I can't believe it. She was like, fuck yeah, I got a job at NASA. And some dude commented and was like, watch your mouth. And she was like, suck my dick. I work at NASA. She got fired from NASA because the person that commented regulates the space or one of the space censorship things. Like checks all social media of anybody involved in the corporation to make sure they're not posting anything blatant or like that. And she got fired. I'm like, freedom of speech, though. And then that was the big issue. But it was like this weird push and pull of how quickly you can say something if you're not regulated, that it can actually be seen in a different light. And then it can be taken the whole wrong way of it.
Yeah, and I'd say from that, I'd see two kind of issues. Like when I compare Canada and the United States, Canada, it does technically have freedom of speech and under our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but that didn't come along till the 20th century. But it's limited by the hate speech laws. And when I was younger, I was probably much more of an extreme civil libertarian who thought there should be no hate speech laws, anything goes. And as I've gotten older, I've just kind of seen the perspective of the people that those laws protect. Like, you can't deny the Holocaust. You can't say a lot of homophobic stuff can be protected, a lot of racist stuff. It's a huge process, though, to ever be charged and kind of fined with that in Canada. I could probably count on two hands the number of people who have ever gone through that. It's really like someone has to get a lot of publicity, and then suddenly the government will do something. It's not one of their favorite things to do, but it does exist, and that is a limit, like you said. On the other issue, I always wonder about the difference between public and private free speech. Because yes, you can say whatever you want and the government shouldn't step in. But then, like you were pointing out, if you've got a job and you say something, like you go and call your boss an asshole or something, you're probably not going to keep your job too long. And is that free speech, or is that, I don't want to say reality, but is it the reality of working and living with other people sometimes?
Yeah.
You can't dodge the consequences of your speech.
I think that's also a thing about Canada. Like, how loose is your immigration laws, for instance?
We're probably looser than, it's kind of different. We're looser than the US. Like, we let in terms of proportion, more people than you guys do. But we have, and I find this funny that this is something some people like Trump have wanted to do. We have kind of a system where, in terms of immigrants, we kind of score them. Like, we look at what they have in terms of qualifications, education. We have preferential treatment for people who might bring in money and start a business. You could have a debate about that. Like, is that really a great idea to let people buy their way into the country? But we have more come in, but we kind of like screen them, I'd say, a bit more. And we do have a more open refugee policy. We probably take more refugees than the US, but it's only about 25, 30,000 a year, just because we're like a ninth the size of the US. So everything's proportional, you know?
It's kind of like the whispering word. Like whenever we talk about a great country or good country, everyone always mentions Canada first. I have no idea how that slipped through. But I love Canada. I'm not crapping on it at all. But it's the same thing with America. We're known as the land of opportunity, and I'm like, I think the issue is. I think immigration's good, but I think there is a point when you have to understand is when you start accepting people from all over, your cultures and everything get really kind of mixed match in your country. And then next thing you know, everyone's got different views and morals based on where they're from. And that's why we start having splitting opinions where people can't really get together on something because they're all thinking in completely different perspectives. And that doesn't mean saying that we shouldn't have immigration. That just means we need to go the extra mile of being able to understand that person's perspective. And you're never going to do that unless you ever travel. If you've ever talked to anyone who's ever been like out of their country, other countries, lived there for a while, they start to be able to rationalize a lot of the stuff if you just explain to like, hey, over here, women are only allowed to share 90% of their body. And they use goats as a trade system as well. And you're like, what the fuck kind of living is that? Like, do they have a cell phone charger? Can they plug in their phones? Well, not really. They don't actually have phones down there. Actually, they live in a hut that's kind of made of clay. And you're like, made of clay? Like, it sounds baffling. But if you go over there and then you live in that, you go, oh, I understand it. But with all of it happening over here, it's like, we're not understanding that person's perspective because we don't uneven it goes back to like you said about the slavery thing. You have no realm of example to understand what that is, so you'll never be able to understand those emotions and why there's that tension, why there's this like pressing matter that's going on, why there's these people rioting and doing all these things, because you're not able to comprehend what that's like. Neil deGrasse Tyson says it when he goes, when we try and explain what dark matter or gray matter is, whenever you explain something in the world, you use another thing to explain it, such as let's say your phone. It's about the size of maybe your fist and half of your other fist. You're using examples. You're using something to reference how many of this you can put into that. That's the same thing. You can't do that when you are trying to understand slavery because you have no point of reference. What are you going to say? It's like the Great Depression, but you're born in the 2000s. That doesn't make any sense of how you would even be able to comprehend it. You have to be able to experience something as close in relation to be able to fully comprehend, unless you're really trying your hardest to find a sense of empathy through it. Like, it's taken me the longest time during this whole situation we were experiencing a couple months ago with the riots, was when everyone was like screaming and saying it's for the kids, for the kids. And I was like, I don't have kids. I can't, it's so hard for me to rationalize what a parent would think if you have, are you a father?
Yes.
Okay.
Two
So
young kids.
yeah, I just remember now you mentioned in the beginning, you said your kids, which I was
Okay.
like, that's the answer everyone wants to hear, but what's the
That's the
real one?
easy cop out. Yes.
But when I was trying to understand the perspective of what it would be like to be a parent and have your kids suffer, I didn't truly get that until I saw a buddy of mine through the podcasting industry put up a video and say, I don't do this. I don't go to work every day to benefit my life. I go to work every day because of my son. And then his son jumped on his back and was like, Dad, let's play. And I was like, fuck, I get it now. Like, it took me to get to that level of understanding to understand why there was this force and why there was this tension that was going on, to be able to rationalize that. And I've been trying to do that more in my life. And I'm like, if people could do that with more in their life, you could understand more about history. You could understand more about this. You could understand more about that. It goes hand in hand because a lot of the times we're making the same mistakes now that we did back in the day. And a lot
Mhm.
of it is because we're not understanding the perspective and the thoughts that are going through another person's head. We only consider our own.
Yeah, I mean, another thing I think of from what you were talking about was when I look at some of the recent immigrant communities, a lot of what they believe sometimes when they've come over from like some of the places you describe is not that different in some ways from what people here thought 50, 60 years ago. Like a lot of those more social conservative ideas were the mainstream like 100 years ago, like how women were treated, that being gay was basically illegal, things along those lines. And so I see it a lot of like they're coming from a place that we were in and that we've changed from. I mean, I'm not going to say like evolved because you could say whether it's good or bad, like I don't want to pretend like we're somehow ahead of anybody else. I'm just saying more that the culture in North America is coming from a very different place that's gone down a different road from the people in, let's say, Saudi Arabia. But they've also come along quite a bit since, due to their interactions with us and the rest of the world. And that's one of the reasons I'm kind of in favor of Canada's immigration policy, because I just think, yes, it's going to be a lot of problems with culture clashes if we bring a lot of people over. But at the same time, we're then going to start to make connections to those cultures. And a lot of the people, like second, third generation immigrants I've grown up with here, if other than perhaps things like skin color or religion, you wouldn't see a difference between them and even someone like me. They probably would sound the same with the same kind of Canadian accents, depending on where they're from. And that's just one of the reasons I support that. But I totally see your point about, you always have to be concerned with the clash of cultures. And more importantly, how are we relating that to one another? How are we trying to integrate and communicate?
And it's so difficult too, because I think we have this idea of that the human race is like this perfect species that we could all live together in harmony. And I'm like, if it was like that, it would be like that, but it's not. And the reason why is just because humans are so uniquely different. I mean, if I would love if this country or the world could be so opened up where everyone could live in perfect harmony, but we're always looking for an issue. We always need something to work towards or works against. And that's like the biggest thing that for me that was blowing my mind that's going to change everyone's history was the aliens thing. Once that thing came out that in the COVID-19 bill that the House has 180 days from January 1st to release the information on aliens, I'm like, this is what we need. We need to know that there's something bigger than us out there to work towards to make sure it doesn't ever hurt us or just it's like an enemy, an impossible enemy. It's like a goal. It's all of us going to be able to come together and be like, look, I know we're in different countries. I know there's this bullshit tension we have, but that's a big issue. Like that thing is from a different space galaxy and it could blow us up in a second. So let's put aside our differences until we can handle that. It's a come together type situation, It's something that you would see like in the space race. All these types of things are happening. Everyone's trying to build up and go into outer space. It's a competition, but it got our mind off the war. It got us focused onto something. It got us moving on to a different task. I think that's what's the simple fix in a lot of scenarios is just finding a way to come together over something. We need an enemy, sadly. It's never going to be this lull movement where it's like perfect peace times because then we just start fighting and kind of creating conflict between each other.
Yeah, I think that was I'm trying to remember who. Oh, Ronald Reagan once said that when he was negotiating some kind of treaty with Gorbachev, that if aliens, invaded tomorrow, we'd all be on the same side. And I just find it funny because there's even, I used to read conspiracy theories a lot when I was younger, and there were people who theorized that there actually were no UFOs. It was an attempt to get us to do that. I think that's kind of like the plot of Watchmen or something,
Yeah.
that idea. And I just was, yeah, I had a thought there, but now I've lost it.
Well, think it's like what you were saying before about like the credible sources thing, for instance, where we were talking about before. Imagine you're a person who's found many articles, many things that were telling you that aliens aren't real, and you've established multiple books saying that alien life isn't real. Then they come out with this saying that they're gonna release anything about unidentified flying objects. And you're like, so what information was I using? And the government's just like, that was just some shit we tossed out and seeing who would catch on to it, and you ran with it. So now we're gonna give you the real information. I'm like, that's what I'm saying is don't be definitive on an answer. Don't be definitive on anything. There's just you have to, it was like I know you said you didn't like the person that's not really 100% on anything, but obviously there's some stuff that's rational. We're breathing oxygen. So that's fucking real. You know that. But when it comes to so much stuff, especially with some serious like stuff matters that go on in the history of the world, I mean, I think a lot of the issue of why like I've talked to a few anthropologists and they're like right now human culture is just under fire constantly. And I'm like, yeah, because a lot of the history is written by the winner. And a lot of times in that mindset back then, to show off is like the worst thing possible to what we think of now, which is like we went over and we conquered all the Native Americans. That looks really bad now to us, but back then that was a sense of strength and pride. That was a thing of like how tough as a nation as we are because we were always trying to show off our guns. You know what I mean? We're always trying to show our muscles and flex. And it's like you got to understand too. if you would have came out and told people that George Washington's teeth were made of slave teeth instead of cherry wood, a lot of people would have said a lot of shit. So that's why they made it like, oh, it's made of cherry wood because it sounds better on paper. You don't want to think that you're, you know, cherishing a like criminal or cherishing a psychopath that's putting other people's teeth in his mouth.
Yeah, and that actually leads me to think of something that I've thought about in my life in terms of dealing with racism. I'm trying to remember who it was who said it, but I think it was Ta-Nehisi Coates, who he talked about something called the evil child molester Nazi trope, which is basically that when you look at culture, every time we see a movie, a lot of books and that, all these characters that show racism are extreme evil. They're like scummy people, you know what I mean? They abuse kids, all this stuff. And then he said, but when a lot of white people especially look at who the racism they've seen in their life, it's like your grandpa. And I even had that. I loved my grandpa, but he was this old Scottish guy who talked about Jews and Catholics and, forgive me using this word, Chinamen all the time. And now that I'm older, I'm just like, oh God, I love that man. But what he said sometimes was not the best. And I think that's the problem of, we have to start to see that a lot of that comes from not like evil. And that then leads me to, it makes it sound like I'm saying racism and evil, and I think it is. But we have to then understand on the individual level, these people are acting out scripts that they've been had put into their heads their entire lives, comes from their culture, comes from the place of what you talked about of, our culture is based on, we came over, killed some people, took some land, and thought it was a great thing for 300 or 400 years. We're kind of having second thoughts about that now and saying, how do we fix this? And so if we try to drop this thing of like, everything is evil, it's more about, what do we change? What is it that, like you were saying, we realize this doesn't work anymore, this whole law by conquest, taking the land. So what do we do now to fix that? How do we stop from continuing this cycle if possible?
It's like, can you imagine in 30 years from now what they're going to be thinking then? Like looking back, like, why the fuck was it in 2020 they were all wearing masks in the commercials? Like, was there just this weird year that they had? Like, just the whole mindset, like how we've adapted so quickly. It's like when you understand that the human mind is this complicated thing that we barely understand and how quick it is to change. I mean, in anybody's perspective can change with just some information hits you one day and next thing you know you're like, oh well, I don't think that way anymore. It's just kind of like an insight, like somebody unlocks the pathways to your brain or something. But think 20 years, 30 years from now, they're going to be like, well, they thought what, they thought this, they thought that. And you got to understand, rationalizing with the time period. Our grandparents, for instance, they were grown up and that's the way that they thought. And when people say like, oh, that person's just racist, it's like, no, that's the time period's thinking. We should look at our progression past that. Look how we've evolved from that. Because if we sit there and keep bitching and complaining about the past, it's never going to be the past. It's going to be right now, and it's going to cause evident problems happening today. We're not saying you should ever forget about it, but we need to find ways to evolve moving forward with it without creating conflict again, creating that same issue and sparking tensions where like people are like, I think Bob Saget said it. He was at a comedy club in Boston and some dude said something about the South will rise again. And he's like, it's been like fucking almost 100 years. Like you had your time, you're kind of out of it, but it's just that idea of like hashing old shit. Like, why are you trying to fight in a fight that died 100 years ago? Why are you trying to bring that up and act like it's going to be this thing that's still coming into the future? It's like, you're just creating conflict for conflict. It's like you're not even really rationalizing yourself anymore and understand that we're progressing pretty quickly. That is also an issue, is that we need to understand like the best predictor of the future is the past, and not just our past, Canada's past, China's past.
Hmm.
They've all been through the same shit. We've all have, based on our moralities, different thoughts. So that means every nation, every country, every place has probably had the same thought as you and tried it and it didn't work out. There's been some stuff America's done that Canada probably hasn't done yet and is probably just thinking about doing it. Then there's stuff that America hasn't done that Canada's already done, and then America's starting to do it. We're all just, it's like a fucking trend, just slowly working its way around the globe.
And I think the change that we're also struggling with too is, and I've seen this from reading some history as well. And ironically, I'd use places like France and Germany, where it used to be that a lot of the people there didn't think of themselves as French. they were from Brittany and were a Breton and all this other stuff. And then gradually over like 18th, 19th century, they came together and became France. Now they still have a lot of regional identity, but now there's this national identity. And so when I look at stuff like Brexit and Trump, I sometimes find myself wondering if over this century we're getting to a point where we are becoming a global civilization. And we're now seeing a lot of people being like, well, I'm an American, I'm a Canadian, I'm not, part of whatever we're coming to. But the path of our civilization over the last few hundred years, for better or worse, depending on your point of view, to me looks like we're reaching a point where we're all going to come together in some kind of global entity. Will that be a good one or a bad one? Who knows what's going to be the price when we get there? And I just think a lot of that is being reflected in this clash of ideas because we're having to come together. Our economics, our social stuff, the fact that we could talk to someone around the world immediately is showing that we don't have these isolated spots anymore. All these ideas are coming together, and we have to figure out how to do it, how to make it work.
It would be easier if the United Nations was like a speed dating thing where each person had to have like an hour to chat with another person. So it was like China would talk to America, America would talk to this, and then there'd be a bunch of like, so you had to go through all whatever, how many nations are involved. It would probably take a couple of days, but each person would get an hour to understand that person's perspective and have a chat with that person. The next thing you know, it's like, well, I don't like China because of this. It's like, well, do you understand China's thinking of it this way and you're thinking of it this way? Just a bunch of people understanding everyone's perspective. Next thing you know, there's going to be probably a lot more agreements on stuff. Like, yeah, why are we? I see your perspective now. I'm not really wanting to fight over that anymore because I see where you're coming from. And then it's like this whole rational talking. But as soon as you get down to doing something like that, everybody's got to start yelling and screaming. And it's got to be who's the top dog? Who's the guy that's got to be the louder voice? It's like, yo, at one point we need to understand we're all on the same giant rock in outer space and we're just separated by what, a couple thousand miles apart. That's not that much if you really think about the grand scheme of things. I mean, come on now.
No, especially when you think of the distances of, space and the universe, like there's nothing else nearby. There's no one else. Like, I don't even know if there's aliens farther away,
About
but
to
there
say, not
definitely
yet.
aren't
We
any
don't
nearby.
we
Yeah.
don't know yet.
Yeah. So, I mean, to me, it's just there's no alternative. The biggest sticking point to me always comes in, though, like a lot of people are on board with change, talking to other people. But then when it comes down to the nitty gritty of like, okay, we've talked about it. You now have to do this, and I have to do that. And that to me is then another step beyond the talking, where it's kind of like everybody has to put their money where their mouth is and actually enact some of these changes. Because when I look at things in Canada, again, like the Indigenous issue, there's been God knows how many different like royal commissions, papers on the issue, looking at how we can fix this. The committee, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was a huge one, and yet they put out all these great recommendations and nobody implements it. So we've done the talking sometimes, not all the time, but nobody then acts on it. It just feels sometimes like a lot of people just want to keep like, okay, we'll keep talking to one another, but in the meantime we're going to keep doing this thing that benefits me while we talk.
I think at some point someone had warped all of our perspectives into thinking that this is a game. And the problem is once
Hmm.
you start thinking it's a game, you start wanting to become the winner and you never want to be the loser. And when that comes into perspective, then you really do some shady stuff to make sure you're always going to be the one that's in the lead. And it's like that with anything in our judicial system in America, for instance. It's considered a game, kind of, whether you're guilty or you're innocent. Based on matter of facts, people will warp those facts and no clear evidence that you're going to put maybe an innocent person in jail just on the assumption of you don't want to lose. That's a giant issue. And I think that's like that with our states. When we go into wars, when we go into this, it's like, are we supposed to be over there? Why are you doing that? It's like because we want to be the best, we want to be the biggest, we want to be whatever. But it's anything that gets established in history. There's got to be a clear winner and loser when it's written in text. We got to know exactly what happened. But the way we write it is never a good way, whether it's Canada's history or whether it's America's history. It's written in a way that makes it seem like, okay, you're definitely sided here. Like you're biased towards this. You're not really open to both realms of everything. You're kind of just explaining this whole point. Like they were this giant thing that came over and they were badass. It's like, what about the downside of stuff? Like biggest mind blow to me was pirates, for instance. I thought they were fucking badass. Everything you see of Pirates of the Caribbean, they're all on ships, like, sexing up the ladies, getting their pistols and shooting and robbing ships. A lot of them are gay. Think it through. A bunch of guys on a ship for a very long, extended period of time. It's like being in prison, and you wonder why that's a big issue. Is because you need love, you need handle and care. And at that point, you're on a ship for 8 months. You don't care if it's a dude or not. So it's not homophobic. It's just real stuff nobody ever talks about. It's information that's like, oh, I get it. I see the perspective of it. You know what I mean? A lot of people aren't getting that information. They're seeing something completely different, like being shown Pirates of the Caribbean on television and thinking it's like that, rather than looking up the history and be like, oh, it was nothing like that. Actually, they were pretty sad, and a lot of them would kill themselves based on the fact that they missed their families.
Yeah, and they didn't live like a luxurious life. They were often just stealing to survive. If I don't know as much about it, but I remember reading some of it. And some of them were escaping sometimes the crimes they've committed, but they were also escaping shitty lives, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I had a thought and I'm lost in it. Sorry about that. It's
Welcome
getting
to
up
the
so
show.
early in
I'm
the
I'm glad
morning.
I'm glad
Yes.
you're in out of the blank. But like when I was studying about I think it was like the Chang dynasty when they were dealing with this I forgot what drug it was. It was like this thing that they would chew the leaves of this plant, not coke or anything. It happens to do it's
Not like cat, is it? Or no, cats, I think, in Africa.
there it's something that starts with a C.
Okay.
I'm trying to think of what the name of it is, but it links down into there's a documentary called Dino Fish where they found a 600 million year old coelacanth fish that they thought had been dead. And the
Oh,
reason
that one, yeah.
Yeah, the reason why they discovered it was because dynamite. Fishermen were throwing dynamite into the water and blowing up. Those fishermen are Somalian pirates, is what we call them. And the reason why is because they actually used to be known as the volunteer firefighter or volunteer fire service of Somalia, because they used to actually help out the town. But from all the different types of influence of commercial fishermen, completely were just capturing all the fish, where these self-made fishermen, these self-owned business people, these people that were just going out on their little boats, couldn't stand up against these yachts that were catching thousands of pounds of fish and selling it at the market for real cheap. They were running out of business. So what they started doing was they would start robbing these ships. They would start capturing them and holding them hostage for ransom for money and stuff like that. And eventually they started eating this drug that was like speed, which is like a little bit of a plant. It's like a natural, like if you eat coffee beans, it's like that,
Hmm.
but it's like a natural speed. They became really skinny and really jacked and look like they're on drugs. And then they ended up becoming known as Somalian pirates. And that's just what they do to survive now. It's this whole perspective of like, you can sit there, read that, oh my God, Somalian pirates are capturing ships. And you could sit there and say, oh my God, we got to stop these people. Or you could be the person that dives deeper into it and tries to understand how they became that way and really realize that they're just people that were trying to survive in a world where we keep wanting to expand and not caring about the things we're expanding upon.
And that they were in response to the actions of others who, you can look at it anyway, but some of those people that are like sailing their yachts around there, some of them are also like dumping their sewage out. I've heard that about some of those
Yeah.
cases. So that's what's really provoked that type of behavior. And like you said, seeing that perspective, I mean, to me, it also goes back to what you were talking about with the history we're told. I think there's a dichotomy or a dilemma in that we have to have these national myths or even sometimes societal myths to create a society. Like the United States has the story of the founders, the revolution. And without going into too much detail in that, of course, there's a lot of stuff that's just kind of pushed off to the side, or we're going to present this glossy picture. Canada has that, of course. There's even one website I use as a reference that calls a nation by consent. And I always find myself wondering what Indigenous and French people would think of that notion, but that's a separate story.
Yeah, Canada's
The,
got the craziest thing is that you literally you have two different languages basically. You have French and then you have English. So it's like some people either really just only know the English or some people know both languages.
yeah, I mean, to be fair, most of the people like where I grew up out here, I'm on the West Coast, just above Seattle, and we were a completely Anglo culture. We had more people probably who spoke Mandarin or Punjabi than French. There's little French presence out here, except perhaps on the military bases. And it's really geographically centralized around Quebec, New Brunswick, and a little bit of the East back there. And it's one of the things I'm almost going to get to explore soon is that we passed things on bilingualism about 50 years ago, but no, I didn't get French until I was like 12. And by that point, I think that's a little too late to teach somebody languages. Like it should have been, I always think of the EU where they're teaching kids 2 or 3 languages when they're 5. If you really wanted to have a bilingual country, that would make more sense. Now, about 30% of Canada or so does speak French. There is a lot of people who either speak 2 languages and speak French, but there's huge swaths of the country, especially where I live, that are just all English. And so it's kind of funny that there's like that dual nature of Canada, that there's really stretches of the country where like you're not going to hear any French for a while.
It's nuts, man. I wish I spoke another language. I look at that like I'm
I
doing
do too, yeah.
I look at it like I'm just missing out a whole avenue of people to talk to. Like, you know what I mean? Like it's so selfish. Like I know it's like, oh, but you're just a person, you know English and you're talking to people. Yeah, I get that. But at the same time, you know what option and avenue I'm missing? Like the fact of like my thing I would do when I worked at a hotel was we would get a lot of Romanian and Bulgarian students over here, and I would try my hardest to learn their language because they're already doing 95% of the work of coming to a new place and trying to learn our language. Like English is the only language that is universally taught. It's we don't have to learn Chinese over here. We don't have to learn all these other things. And it's like everyone is conforming to our way of thinking and our idea of thinking. It's like the least we can do is go the extra mile, or not even the extra mile, meet them halfway and be like, hey, let me learn some of your words to make you feel more comfortable, because there always is that sense of uncomfortability, just like starting a conversation with somebody for the very first time. On here, it's like, where's this going to go? It's like having that comfortability, what's going to get those things down? And I feel like the easiest way is just by chatting, by talking and watching that grow and watching that connect, where you start realizing you have more in common than you do apart. The issue is people bring up the very, very corrupting things in the world, which are, let me bring up politics. Let me bring up this and this and this. Yeah, you can talk about that stuff, but don't get upset when a person doesn't agree with the things you agree with. You know what I mean? And that's the point, is everyone, as soon as they hear that disagreement, they want to walk away. And I'm like, you can't do that, because then you're not coming to a conclusion. You're just getting pissed off.
Yeah, and I think one of the things about languages too, and I'm probably way out of like my knowledge field here, but when I look at linguistics and that, I think knowing more languages is probably another way to get some of the other perspectives, because I've read people who say when you have to speak in another language, like if you're English and you're then switching over to French, you're almost using a different part of your brain in a way, because everything is different. The structure is different in terms of the words you're using. So you have to kind of switch. I don't know if that's necessarily the best description. Again, I only speak English and I don't know much about linguistics, but I've read people say that that helps you to see the world almost differently, even just through the act of talking, because you're trying to communicate, okay, this concept is completely different in another language. It's not even expressed with just like the same rough translation. It's expressed in a completely different way. Like I look at something like Chinese, be it Mandarin or traditional, and I see things like, oh, wow, okay, all these symbols. I'm really bad at linguistics, so I can't even begin to comprehend that. But I could see how it starts to give you a different perspective and a different view of everything, if that's even how you have to communicate.
Kind of like traveling, like going to another place and understanding the struggles that another nation is going through when you're able to actually live and experience it for a little while. Makes awesome sense if you start looking at maybe one day we'll have time travel. Let's go back to the age of like Magellan when he's trying to circumnavigate the globe and be like, "Oh, I understand. I can't even read this fucking map, man. We give you so much shit for not understanding how the world works and discovering this or that and this and that. You were all mixed up. You're going all over the place." It's like, I see. It's very, very hard to navigate a boat when you don't have a GPS telling you where to go. You're using the freaking stars. Are you nuts?
Or you're sick half the time.
Yeah. So I keep getting seasick. I can't keep reading the map, and every time I do, I gotta reorganize it because I'm using it as a napkin.
Yeah, and half the ship is dead, and everywhere we land, they're trying to kill us with good reason most of the
If you
time.
could pick a time period to go back to understand more, like maybe an event, what would you pick?
I'd often, I feel like I don't know if I'd go back for the understanding, but sometimes I've thought about World War One just because the idea of what it was like in a trench. I mean, that might sound a bit cliche, but it's kind of like, oh God, what was it like standing around, in mud that basically was full of piss and shit most of the time.
Yeah.
There were rats, like, and then you've got like constant noise everywhere, bombs, barbed wire. Like, it sounds like a vision of hell. And that would be, and I know it wasn't the experience all the time. Like, a lot of times those guys were shipped in and out. They did shifts, you do like a week or 2 weeks. I can't remember the exact time, but that's like what it was. But just the idea of like, you're going to go off and you're going to do your shift in hell. Like, to me, it would be something not in any way comparable, but similar to the idea of like, what if we all went back and lived as a slave for a week? You get up, you work 12 hours till the sun goes down. There's the prospect of violence. You have no choice over what you can do in your day, like, just imagining what every day would be like in those environments.
Now, if I could give you that same question, but you can pick a ridiculous answer, what would it be? Like, if you could pick anything that would be just so selfish for you, be like, this is what I really want to know.
I'd want almost to have like go back to some of those times with like some kind of quiet, invisible airplane, so I could just fly overhead and watch, like Alexander the Great or something, like pick one of those, or Genghis Khan, like, okay, I'm watching. Oh, well, they're killing everybody in the city, things like that. Like, not that I'd want to see the gore and the violence, but just kind of like having like this giant bird's eye perspective to watch it all happen. Or you could even go back further, and I think about when people were like crossing the Bering Strait and during the ice ages and coming to the Americas, like just watching how those people did that. How did these people that we see as not having a lot of the technology and knowledge we have, how did they travel thousands of miles and basically start somewhere new, you know, 10, 20, 30, 40,000 years ago?
It's a good
That'd be
answer.
kind of interesting to see too.
It's a good answer. Hmm. Made
What
me
about for you?
I'll say made me think of mine a little bit. I think the pyramids, even though I've already gotten
Hmm.
confirmation from an Egyptologist that it's kind of like it was an alien, so like, all right. But then the alien things came out, and I'm like, hang on a second, what are we talking about here? But I guess I would like to see that growth and kind of how that was built. Maybe a little selfish intent. I would probably say there's two things. One, I want to know about Paul Revere. I want to know that did he have any breaks on his ride? Like at one point, you didn't have to take a piss or something to hop off your horse. I kind of would like to know that that was a thing. So he's not this idealistic hero in my mind. You know what I mean? There's like this, he did the craziest thing, said the British are coming, the British are coming. I'm like, but I wanna know that there was a flaw because it makes them more human and relatable when you understand that there's a flaw behind them. And, then maybe the other one would be like, I would like to go back to where Socrates was like starting to kind of write a bunch of stuff, or Da Vinci, being able to watch an inventor in the works and see how that process was. Whereas, like, was Da Vinci really as smart as he said? Or was he just taking a bunch of ideas from other people? You know what I mean? I would like to know that whole thing.
That would be really interesting too. Yeah. I also remember things like not to bring up like a TV show, but something like The Nick that was on a while back, which was about a hospital around 1900, and go back and see like, okay, so how did they figure out, even just the basics of wash your hands and stuff, that we seem to be having trouble with in terms of now wearing masks and washing our hands, but go back say 100, 200 years when they started figuring all that out too.
The Art of Butchery is a great book that you need to read. So I used to do a spinoff of this podcast called Fill in the Blank, which would give you
Hmm.
specific topics. I would ask anybody that was on, like, hey, what's a topic you really want to talk about? And my buddy, first episode goes, I want to talk about 19th century Victorian surgery. I'm like, he could have picked anything in the boat of like information. So I started learning a lot about like Robert Liston and Joseph Lister, the guy who they basically named Listerine after. But like listening to the art of sanitation, where back in the day they didn't even understand like contamination, germs, any of that type of stuff. And then they started realizing, oh wait, if we put water on our tools and clean them off a little bit, it actually could help reduce contamination. But then they didn't even do that right. They weren't using warm water to kill off the germs. They were just putting it under water. So it was like it wasn't really actually doing a whole lot of sanitation, and seeing that whole growth in like a short, like 50-year time period where it's like surgery used to be an event. Like people would go and see like wrapped around a whole entire room observing this thing. Like that was their theater. They dude was eating popcorn and shit on the side. And then like now it's like this whole thing of like you're not allowed to go behind the doors unless you're family. And even then they don't want you back there. It's like this whole weird
Yep.
shift and pull to see how our minds have looked at entertainment into different forms.
Yeah, and I guess like nowadays too, we'd probably think it would be like a bit ghoulish. Like I could see if other doctors were going there, and watching and learning, but it's just kind of like, oh, we're going to invite somebody off the street to come in and, watch an open heart surgery. I think also back then it started off that a lot of times the people were, it was almost like a last resort. Like you felt like you were probably going to die anyway, so you might as well let them do surgery on you. Otherwise, I don't know how much like what their chances of survival were. I mean, another book I remember too is there was one, I'm trying to remember the name, but it was about the one US president who got assassinated, James Garfield.
Oh
And
yeah.
it turned out that the bullet actually didn't kill him. It was right around the dawn of germ theory, and the doctors kept poking him with stuff to try to see how the wound was doing. And they basically gave him sepsis. And that's what actually killed him.
Ah, it's like when you find out that Abraham Lincoln, when he got shot, he didn't die right on the spot.
Oh, God.
He
Yeah.
so he died 9 hours later with a bullet in the back of his eye.
Ugh.
Can you imagine
Imagine
that?
what that was like. Yeah.
Oh my! Here's my theory is like so maybe like if, I don't think it's real, but it's kind of fun to entertain it a little bit, which is like Abraham Lincoln during the war times came to the giant corporations, the oil companies, asking for a bailout of cash for the war. This is around the time people were knocking on other people's door and they were taking all your silver and they were using it for ammunition. Um, so he was asking, "Hey, can you loan us out some money because we need to try and get through this war? We're out of money and we have no way to profit, and we're just going to end up we're going to lose." The corporation said, "Yeah, but you have to do this for me." And Abraham Lincoln said, "I'm not doing that." I want to know what that was that they were telling him to do, that he wouldn't do it, to where he left and printed his own money. He started making his own money, and this is why our money's green. They're actually called greenbacks because of Abraham Lincoln. Then, not even was it 2 weeks later or a month later, he gets shot in the head by a fucking actor. I'm like, is that some secret dark society shit? Like John Wilkes Booth shooting him in the head as an actor had no fucking frame of and then not even this. Ready? 2 weeks after John Wilkes Booth did that, his brothers almost got hit by a car. Now think that through. That sounds like a coincidence, but understand that cars weren't advanced as they are today. So if you were going to get hit by a car back then, moving 5 miles an hour, you were intentionally trying to fucking hit somebody. You weren't just like, so it was like this whole weird thing. Like maybe he was like assassinated, like by a secret society. But then to think that after he was shot in the back of the head, the bullet got lodged right behind his eye. And he sat there laid out on a bed for 7 hours and suffered. And then in the last few hours of his life, he created the Secret Service. So it was like, what? Like to understand that, I really want to go down back to that time period even and try and understand what the hell was going on. Like ask John Wilkes Booth, before you do what you're about to do, why is my biggest question. I think that's what everyone should always ask is the question of why. But the answer should never be because that's how it is. That's a fucking terrible answer. You got to pick a better one than that.
Yeah, and I think Booth they were part of some grand plan that they were going to kill Lincoln, the vice president, the secretary of state, and like one guy backed out. One actually tried to kill the secretary of state and didn't succeed. But even with that plan, it's kind of like, so you killed three guys. You still lost the war. Richmond and Atlanta are still burning. What else are you going to do?
It really makes you think, dude, like, oh, come on, just tell me there's a secret society just so I know. Like everybody's hinted at it. I just want to know at this point.
I think when I was younger, and I believed more in conspiracy theories, just being honest, but I don't put much stock in them now. But I think it was for that reason of like, well, maybe some of this would make sense if there was, some giant evil plan that somebody was enacting.
There was more effort putting them back in the day. Like that one I just said, that's a lot of thinking into that one. But then you toss out flat earth. And then at this point, it's like, all right, I have fucking eyes, man. I know that the earth's not flat. Thank you for that. It's like, how do you know, bro? The pictures were fake. It's like, can we find the
I know a
fun
guy who
ones?
flies helicopters and he can go up and see the curve of the earth. That'd be
I've
one thing.
actually talked to people that have been into space, and let me tell you, it is. And I also can tell you from a volcanologist point of view that Hollow Earth is fake too. So there you go.
I always thought Hollow Earth would sound fun though. That would be one that, as crazy as it sounds, it kind of like, oh, that'd be cool if you like flew a plane into the North Pole and you went down and there was this complete other world.
There is
I mean, I
mole
don't even
people.
want
Mole
to.
people is a thing, but there isn't like that where there's underground tunnel systems. There are layers to this earth, and there is lava in the middle. It's not like Brendan Fraser and Journey to the Center of the Earth.
No, I mean, was there a really bad movie, The Core, that was about that? That basically the whole core of the Earth is just molten lava. If you tried to actually go down there, you couldn't. If I'm correct on that.
It really brings up the thing of like, you're gonna dig all the way to China. It's like, no, I'm gonna hit magma before I dig all the way to China, sir.
Yep, and you're gonna die.
If a little
Or
kid said that to me, like I'm gonna hit magma before I go to the China, I would just look at him and be like, shut up, like get in your hole. Like, what are you doing?
that might have been me when I was a kid. I was like really young when Mount St. Helens erupted, which shows how old I am. And I was obsessed with that for like a couple of years. I like looked at all the pictures of what it looked like before the volcano exploded. Then after, it was just like, oh wow. I
It's
was like 5.
rationalized. You have a freaking thing that's about to blow up and you don't know what it could do damage to the earth. It's like I'd be a hella experimenting on like why is nobody else researching this? Like why is nobody else finding this interesting? This thing could go off at any moment.
Yeah, and like I tried to do one episode where I was talking about sometimes that's impacted history, like when something like Krakatoa happens and suddenly the weather is screwed up for 2 or 3 years. Crops fail, there's famines, and so it has even more impact just on the human level because there was that one a few years ago where people couldn't fly to Europe, if I remember correctly, the volcano out of Iceland. So there's a lot more impact even just beyond if people want to learn about geology or something.
It's fascinating. And all this can be found on your show, correct?
I did do one episode on volcanoes and Thomas Malthus, so yes. That was to
Well,
try to get away from a constant episodes about wars.
why don't you let people know where they can find you at?
I have it's Counterfactual Canuck. I'm fairly bad at promoting myself, but you can find me on Twitter, and I do have a website through Buzzsprout, and you can pretty much find me on any of the podcast platforms. I've managed to get myself up there, like Apple, Stitcher. There's probably newer ones that I forget about, Spotify, all that. Just search for Counterfactual Canuck, and you'll find it there.
I'll make sure I link it all in the description. And thank you for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank podcast.